Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm here with another episode of Data Dojo. My name is Swagata Ashwini, and today I have a very esteemed guest, our first male guest. His name is Roger, and he's also part of Data Science Salon. He is a advisor of data to many startups, and I'm really glad to have him. So, hi Roger, nice to have you. So, yeah, why don't you give us a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure. So I've been in the data space a long time. I was kind of lucky that what became known as data warehousing and has turned into data science was a nice amalgam of my backgrounds in, I have a computer science degree, I've got a finance degree and an MBA, and I found that it was a nice intersection of the two. And I've done work for big and small companies. I've done consulting. I've built data teams at a lot of places. I was on Governor Newsom's COVID task force starting in March of 2020 and volunteered on that for a year. And as you mentioned, I've done a lot of consulting with startups and so forth, and keeping my hands on the kind of pulse of what's going on.
I was looking at one of the interviews you had, and I think it was when you were somebody at O'Reilly had interviewed you, and you were talking about how data warehouse, and it was like 10 or 12 years ago, and you were talking about how data warehousing is going to change the future before all of this AI and all these technology has come into play. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are looking at how it has transformed in the past 10 years when you talked about it and now it's like actually happening.
Yeah, it's definitely writ large compared to when I started talking about it. And and there's two, I mean, I'm sure there's more than two vectors, but one is the increasing sophistication of both like distributed computing and cloud stuff, way more data sources than ever before. A lot more rigor around like software type uh, development type infrastructures, GitHub and stuff like that. That wasn't as true 10 years ago. And then Gen AI is clearly going to make a big
Right.
impact. That's more recent part of it. But I think the sophistication has happened pretty fast over the last few years in that direction. And I think all people working in data need to think about that as
Yeah.
something that's part of it.
Given that apart from Gen AI, do you think there are any other trends that you've been seeing that you've identified through your own research over the years?
Yeah, the trends that some of them are things that have stayed the same. Like SQL is still pretty important
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
a background of things. The use of notebooks as a kind of a fundamental way to do exploratory data analytics, and they're getting more sophisticated. I think there's like newer kind of notebook things that really work. Just machine learning in general as a part of it. I still think data folks still need to understand like the fundamentals and not jump
Yeah.
to those
Yeah.
tools too early. But I think that there's still a need to like kind of understand what's going on. I also think, and this is when I say a trend, and this is more anecdotal because I don't have really data to around this, is there's a lot of like kind of jumping into a kind of a pure data perspective. And I think that there's kind of an understanding that you need a like kind of a broader perspective.
Absolutely.
Qualitative data and things like that are becoming a bigger play in all this. But I would say too that the other thing that's been interesting is the consolidation to the kind of big distributed data management systems. I'd say the Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery,
Yeah.
as they're definitely the way a lot of people are going, and I totally get it. They cost a lot, but you don't have to have the resources and the personnel around admin and stuff that don't really get you closer to the business needs you need to do.
And like you mentioned, like it's so important to be very good at learning the fundamentals. I see like so many people who are building Gen AI apps and it's great, but I don't think that's it's just a bubble. Like you need to learn the fundamentals in order to build something novel and be more scalable.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great way to learn, like just to figure out how these things work, and they are fun.
Yeah.
to work with. But I think it comes down to, I was just talking to someone last week and they were like, when it comes down to it, I always start with regression.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's every data scientist first encounter. So I want to ask you about like you work with a lot of, I guess, C-level executives. So what sort of understanding do they need? Like what in order to implement and adopt these latest trends, be it Gen AI or whatever the latest trend is, what level of knowledge and understanding do they need to have, and how do you talk to them and educate them?
Yeah, and it's very difficult. I mean, I'll say that it's difficult, particularly the larger the organization, because the kind of skills that usually get people to those levels in big organizations probably relied a lot on their own personal like intuition and so
Right.
forth. And so now you're trying to say, but you also need to think about data.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing is just trying to remind them that a lot of data work is non-deterministic. And they might not know what that means, but you can talk about probability and stuff, is that you're not always going to find the answer you want, but you're going to find something that will at least make you think about what's going on. And I think that that's one of the critical things, is to know when to let the data buck your intuition. In other words, like having a good filter around that, and embracing surprise. And I'll probably bring this up more than once, that when there's something surprising in there, but goes against everything you think, then you probably should give that some extra time to think about what's going on. The other thing I try to mention is that the data team is a kind of a unique resource. Particularly, I mean, clearly there's a lot of data mesh going on where data work is distributed more and more through companies, but there usually is some kind of central data team, and they're often even a resource for all those organizations. And when you think about it, they're the sensing organism for your
Right.
organization.
Right.
That using them as a resource who has a broad understanding of what's going on in the company can be really valuable. Not that you're asking them to make the decisions, but getting their input at a pretty fundamental stage
Right.
lets you take advantage of all the sensing that they're doing with their data work. The
Yeah.
last thing I would say is there's a guy named Philip Tetlock, professor at Princeton, I think now, who wrote a book called Super Forecasters.
Hmm.
And he's got some like kind of great rules about what makes someone a good forecaster. And you think about sea levels in a lot of ways, that's what they're forecasting.
Yes, job is.
What's next? And a lot of it has to do with being open, uh, being able to take in new information, and not being ideological, but
Yeah.
being flexible, having cognitive flexibility. And they you want to gather a lot of evidence, think probabilistically, probably think portfolio-like too, and being willing to admit error in your thinking, and
Absolutely.
embracing surprise again, like just so that you understand that when something weird is happening, it's probably it's certainly worth understanding why you're surprised by it and if there's something behind it.
Absolutely. I remember like when I started my career as a data scientist, and machine learning was still very novel and new field in its nascent stage. And I had to convince my manager to deploy this machine learning model, and it was for a healthcare organization, and the regulations, it's you cannot just put a model and determine people's lives. So it just like took so much convincing, but how I did it was like you said, like use data, like show them the before and after picture with metrics and what difference it could make. And ultimately it's only going to act as an aid. It's never going to replace, like that's how you project it. It's never going to replace humans. It's only going to make us smarter and more, get us involved in better, higher level tasks than just replace us. So I think, yeah, having data and metrics does the magic.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other part of that, and because it's a quote everyone who works with me here's two things that I often say. One is the George Box quote about all models are inaccurate, but some are useful.
Yeah.
That's a good way to explain the kind of non-deterministic nature of them, and that it doesn't mean this is right. It's that this is what the model shows.
Mhm.
And the other thing is that when you work with data, a lot of times it is a German word, Fingerspitzengefühl, which means fingertip feel.
Mm.
You sometimes get a sense for, and it's almost like it's subjective, but you get a sense for when the data is reliable and when it's not, and how to like deal with it, and how to prioritize its place in your understanding of how things work. And I think that that's important. The other thing too is I think data teams have an obligation to those C levels, and it sounds like what you
Yeah.
did in the case that you did, is to tell a story and not tell them how you did the work.
Yeah.
As proud as you might be of the clever analytics you did or whatever,
Don't tell
what
them.
really
Yeah.
matters is the narrative that they can then use to understand and communicate with other folks about the findings in the data.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. So moving on to like you mentioned about it briefly about like how qualitative analysis. So I'm curious to know like there is a balance that you need to make between qualitative and quantitative data and sort of make that narrative more convincing. So how do you typically, is there a magic formula you have to balance that, or it depends on the use case? Like how do you balance it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously context matters a lot. There is not a magic formula, but I kind of follow a process where, if I get a new problem to look at or a new data set to digest, I'm going to do some EDA.
Yeah.
But part of that EDA is going to be what's missing,
Mm,
right? Because
right.
if you just think that the data you have paints the world, you're obviously going to be wrong. When you think about what's missing, you say, how do I fill that in?
Mhm.
Well, if it's missing, you probably don't have data on it. And that means you've got to figure out other ways to maybe access what might be going on and really expanding your net on what might be there and what you should know.
Mhm.
Uh, there's certainly data people who are really good at the math. And usually, the people come from physics or deep economics and stuff. But there's also people in data who are more generalists.
Right.
And I think that what helps the people who are generalists is that they do have a lot of this kind of qualitative knowledge of how the world works and can bring up things that are like adjacent or
Mm,
tertiary to the real problem that might help explain what's going on. So I think trying to create as complete a picture as possible. Now, it takes more time to acquire your own like bespoke qualitative data. Like, are you going to run a focus group or are you
right.
going to do a survey or whatever? And of
Mhm.
course, surveys have as we all know, have all sorts of problems. But I think when you factor them in, and we used to, when I was at O'Reilly, we ran a lot of surveys. They were like, you would find the nuggets in them that were really helpful.
Right.
And so I think it's important to like round things out when you can
Hmm.
to that. But I say the number one thing is no matter what you're doing, think about what kind of qualitative data might help and if it's available. And if it's not available, note that. If
Right.
we only knew this, if we made this investment, we might find out more. That's there.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot of surveys at our company, and it's like, yeah, you don't know what to do and what to pick, what not to pick. So it's always like, yeah, I get what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
So talking more about like your O'Reilly experience, you've been there for like 16, 17 years, and then even now your experience with engagement with data science salons, I feel you've been involved in a lot of events and community events talking about data. So do you have any like specific memory or something that you would like to share in these events? It could be some common theme or some memory that stood out for you in your experience.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I tried to do, so I was the chair of the Strata conference. So it was I think for a while, it was the biggest data conference. And one of the things I tried to do there was bring in people who weren't in the mainstream of like data science, but
Hmm.
were using data in some unusual way. And, so one of the people I always remember is I brought Bob Mankoff, who was the cartoon editor for The New Yorker.
Oh, wow.
Say, well, why would you bring in the cartoon from The New Yorker? Well, he was getting his PhD in experimental psychology before he became a cartoonist. And he started that. If you know The New Yorker, there's a cartoon at the end
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that you can fill in the caption. Well, he had data on what worked, what
Okay.
were successful things. And I thought, so why would someone care about that? Well, it's a difficult problem to solve. And so he had to be creative in how to like digest that data and how to make sense of it. And I think that those edge cases are what really helps people in whatever they're doing, whether they're doing, ad tech data or health data or whatever, but like to give you those kind of expand your insight into how you might tackle those problems. And yeah, generally, I'm sure a lot of people find this the hallway conversations
Yeah.
usually where you learn. And so when you're doing these events, you want to create the space so that those can happen.
Mm.
Um, so, and I'll just say one other thing. So I have been involved in something called FOO camps. They were an unconference that I was at the first one that O'Reilly put on in 2003. So they've been going on for more than 20 years, and I've been to most of them. And it's very unstructured, and I've had some like kind of wonderful experiences. And one time at one, I know this is a pretty particular story, but I had met the Nobel Prize winner Carol Greeter. She had gotten her Nobel for her work on telomerase, which is what holds your genes together. And I had sat next to her at one event and was talking to her about stuff, and she like wrote in my notebook some stuff about this stuff. And then I was holding another session that she came to, and she's the only one who came. And not like I really knew her, but I said, if you want to go to something else, you should go.
Yeah.
She goes, "Oh, no, let's talk about this subject." And we ended up talking about bicycling in Vietnam.
Wow.
When I think about, it wasn't fulfilling any data stuff, but I got to know a person, better, and had a very unexpected conversation. And I think that it's part of the embracing surprise, that you never know what's going to happen. And so for me, that was like personally, a good thing that happened. And I've probably gone a little too long on this stuff, but I think getting that mix of people who are deep into it with people who are more tangentially related makes for a way to have a kind of a rhythm of big picture, small picture stuff that is part of like any data science person's job.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that's where we are heading towards. Like nowadays, just employing data science techniques is like, okay, what's new in it? Like how can you mix it with maybe some other industry, like maybe agriculture or like something which has never been talked about? So having that diversity of people from different industries using data in some way is what makes like a good story. So I completely understand. Moving on, like I wanted to know like your thoughts, and you talked about it briefly with Gen AI and everything that's been talk of the town. Like, what is the future of data in general, like data jobs? What are your thoughts on it? Like, and how does it affect the business?
Right. Well, I think we're still at a beginning. I
Yeah.
think there's a lot that's going to happen over the next years and decades. And just thinking about, I mean, I started working with big data sets in 2005, and that's, it's almost 20 years ago. And we're still, there's been like height perturbations, but it's still been nothing but up. So I think like everything is just going to become more enriched with data and in different ways. And that big data sets ended up being the basis for Gen AI working.
Right.
So the things I think that are going to be happening is more folks are going to become data savvy. And I think that we've just seen that, and that's going to happen more. That no matter what you're doing,
Right.
you're going to have to know something about data and how that interacts with things you do. And I think that, collectively, we're going to be better at creating a synthesis we've been talking about between data and qualitative work. That instead of like being too much about the numbers and only the numbers, that we'll get better at how to look at how people work and how data interacts with this. There's things like, I'll just use fashion because it's an easy one to pick, where there's fads and things that go in and out of fashion.
Right.
But in fact, it's become so much that we use the word fashion to even describe that. But, I think about things around languages or databases. They're just as faddish as fashion. And so as you understand that, you realize that having historical data doesn't always mean to predict the future, because as humans, we tend to cycle through things, and it's kind of like we're still trying to understand them. And probably behavioral economics is going to become, whether we call it that or not, is going to become a fundamental part of how we go through, working with data and making things work better. Certainly in things like health and stuff, I think for preventive
Right.
medicine, we're going to find a lot better. And I think smart companies will start figuring out how to use Gen AI as an augmentation.
Mhm.
And that will include some data work to figure that out.
Absolutely.
So it'll be like metadata work.
Yeah.
But I think that we'll find that it's good for it's good for organizing things sometimes, but it's a good counterpoint to everything else you're doing. And that having that is like getting another perspective. It's almost like doing extreme programming and
Yeah.
have Gen I as your partner in it. And, I think again, I come back to that embracing surprise, that looking for surprises there. You say, okay, why is that? Why does that happen? I'll just use a quick story. There was an article in the magazine The Atlantic about nutrition, and it's a pretty recent article. It's really about, is ice cream good for you, was the topic. Is that a nutrition study from like 10 years ago found that ice cream correlated most with good health outcomes. And they decided to kind of suppress that because they didn't want people just to be eating ice cream, because they thought there must be something else there. And it ends up, in my eyes, like as we get more sophisticated, we say, okay, we need to figure this out. Ice cream is the biggest correlation. There's got to be something there, whether it's socioeconomic, which is probably part of the case. There might be something special about freezing milk fat that makes them process different. There might be something else around people's willingness to share about that. And I think that the more that we learn about those kind of things, that's the path towards better integration of data. And I do think, this is part of the reason why I think that the augmentation with Gen AI really helps, because I might not know very much about nutrition, but found this result. And I can ask questions in a domain I don't really know.
Yeah.
New exploration areas to do it. But
I actually read that story of ice cream being good for you, and then I Googled it. And you know what? I could find stories to prove both of them. So I was like, I don't know, in this age of information overload, which story to believe. They say this university conducted this study, and then somebody says, no, ice cream is not good for you. So how do you select what's right, what's wrong? That's another.
Yeah, and I think that's I have a feeling a lot of C-level people are probably saying, gee, I invested all this money in my data team, and here I am getting conflicting results or whatever, and I don't really know what to do. Well, you're never going to know what to do. And because if there was an easy answer, we would have figured it out.
Absolutely.
Right? But what you have to do then, I think this is the process that we're getting more sophisticated about, because we're digesting more data and having to work with it, is how to figure out the triangulation and the critical thinking, which I think is going to be increasingly an important skill to have, to wend your way through that. So, the specifics of ice cream, I have a feeling that moderation in ice cream is going to be the best. But I think if you were to really look at it, what you'd probably find are things around socioeconomic factors and people's honesty in answering things. Is that if you're bummed out and you eat that pint of ice cream, you eat the whole pint.
Yeah.
That's not something you're going to want to report.
Yeah.
And having it as a treat periodically is probably okay. It sounds like, well, then the answer is moderation, but I don't really think that is. I think it's like keeping the digging in. The model's inaccurate, but is it useful? Can it help you move towards something that works? And I know, as a thing from nutrition, I mean, we do know that the Mediterranean diet is like a good diet. So when you see conflicting things, it's really on the edges. But we do know from just data around lifespans and stuff that, a kind of a plant-oriented Mediterranean diet is good for your health. And I think we'll find that the equivalence in all sorts of like all organizations will find those equivalents
Mm.
in how to move forward and how to process data correct, in the best way possible.
Right, right. Yeah, well said. I think, yeah, I have one last question is that with everything that's happening, layoffs, and a lot of people are getting stressed out, like people who are getting in, like budding data people, like they are like, does data even make sense as a profession now, given the tech layoffs and all? So what do you think, what is your advice to people who want to step in and are budding data professionals?
Yeah, no, it is a tough market. And I think that like Gen AI, the excitement over Gen AI has occluded just how bad things have gotten in a lot of tech companies. But I think if you really look at it, there's a lot of companies getting too far over their skis and they overhired.
Yeah.
And this is more of a correction than like a recession in this space. But here's the things that I think that matter in the data space is that you really want to round out your skills so that your data skills are a foundation, but what you're really good at is communication, at critical thinking, and understanding organizational dynamics,
Right.
right? If you're on a data team, you're working with all sorts of people all over the place. They tend to have different like motivations. They often even like salespeople, there's a certain stereotype about what kind of people are in sales and stereotype of people in marketing, where you're going to have to deal with people who probably process the world differently than you do. And the more that you can use your communication skills, your critical thinking skills, your listening skills to get at that, the better you're going to be. Yeah, it's good to be good at the math and all that, but what you really want to be good at is integrating into an organization so that your value, which can be intangible, it's hard to put an ROI on good analytics,
Yeah.
as you can't A/B test a company
Yeah.
very easily.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so, you want to be able to not justify your existence, but create a case for your existence as providing the kind of information that was really useful on a really frequent basis. And that means going beyond just doing a dashboard, but like being able to tell those stories that will resonate with
Like
with
good
the,
data storytelling. So what I'm hearing is like this is the age where soft skills actually matter a lot, which are commonly not like, even if you look at the job requirements, they're like put in the nice to have category, but they are actually really the differentiator in this time.
Yeah, I think they will. And I also think in the future they will be too. It's not just during this time, but I think it can lead to like leadership positions, or and not that everyone wants to go into a leadership position, but that kind of more gratifying positions of being kind of complete and knowing how you fit into a bigger picture. In a lot of ways, making a group of people accomplish something, not making, but being a part of a group of people who accomplish something is really satisfying. And I think it's really like a core part of the human existence,
Yeah.
right? You hear like people who study psychology and stuff that reciprocity is like our most important emotion and what separates us kind of most fundamentally from other creatures.
Yeah.
And so how do you become that? Well, if you're working in the data realm, you probably got some math skills and you probably like some quantitative stuff, but you want to fit that into a broader spectrum of ways of thinking. And I think that you'll find yourself being considered more valuable as a result.
Absolutely, 100% agreed. I've seen this happening a lot in many organizations where people who are like team players and participate more in conferences and like have built a digital brand, which is not their really part of their job, but because they are providing more valuable assets to the company than just building machine learning models, which has become more democratized in today's day.
Absolutely. And knowing that it can exist in all even different parts of an organization that you might need to fit into, I think is another part of the soft skill piece of it.
Definitely time to change those job descriptions.
Yeah. I bet they won't change because they're still, it's the first filter is, do you know this or that? And
Yeah.
then it's the soft skill stuff. And certainly there are some superstar analysts and, they're worth something, but I think team building is the really important part because no one knows everything. And, I haven't used the word humility yet. I probably will. but humility is the best way to learn. And
Absolutely.
so that's also another critical skill is, you learn something new and you're like, oh man, I'm so jazzed about this. I really want to show
Yeah.
that it works and
Yeah.
stuff. And then you might like, now you've got like kind of an anchoring bias or some kind of bias to like, oh yeah, I want this thing to work. And it's like, oh wow, it doesn't work. And now I've learned this really valuable lesson, so like being able to do that
Mm.
also, I think that's also pretty critical to critical thinking.
And
Is
it's
that,
so hard to assess, like during an interview. It's just, yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to move to the fun aspect of our session. So I'm going to ask you some really fast questions and you have to just answer them really fast without thinking much. So
yeah,
it's called the rapid fire section. All right. First question. Your favorite data analysis tool?
sequel.
Early bird or night owl?
I am such a night owl. I was up till 1 last night.
All right. One book every data person or data enthusiast should read.
Moneyball. And I encourage everyone who's read it to reread it
All
because it's more fundamentally about how data fits into an organization than it is about the analytics itself.
right. Noted. Most surprising trend you've discovered in your research?
It was surprising in this way. Big data. It wasn't a surprise in that I'd been working with data for a while before it
Yeah.
got big. Um, but I was surprised, I guess, that it got embraced so heavily because
Right.
I started doing data warehouses in the 90s.
Mm, yeah. True.
And so it was like, wow, other people really like this too.
Yeah.
It's become a thing. So I was really pretty, pretty uh, happy about that and surprised.
Nice. One skill every data scientist should have.
I'm going to say two things. One is as large a worldview as possible. Just the more you know about more stuff, the better you're able to contextualize stuff and embracing surprise.
Right. Yes, that's one thing we've mentioned definitely. Cloud or on-premise data
You gotta,
solution.
you gotta mix them. Cloud is great for scaling. It's definitely the way to go. On-prem for exploration. And by on-prem, I actually probably mean on laptop. Like, DuckDB, give me DuckDB and some Python and, a notebook, and I can do a lot.
Most challenging aspect of leading a data team.
Navigating organizational dynamics.
Yeah.
It's, it's no matter what, it's going to be a tough thing to do.
Great. Your go-to method for staying up to date with the tech trends.
Yeah, it's talking to as many people as I can. I definitely read stuff, and I think I'm able to triangulate between different sources of things, and it's impossible. I was at an informal event with two very prestige VCs, and they asked the same question: how do you keep up?
Yeah. Yeah.
No one can keep up. There's too much going on. But when you talk to people, things start, like frothing to the top, and you can like say, okay, I've heard it from 3 or 4 different people I respect. Time to pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think talking to people, reading books, reading articles, just a mix of everything.
Yeah.
Or coffee or tea during analysis or any time.
Okay, I mentioned I'm a night owl. That's
Coffee.
without caffeine. I've never been a caffeine drinker.
Oh, really? Wow. How?
I can't explain it. And I don't sleep very much, which is a problem sometimes. But I do drink tea. I drink herbal teas.
Nice. That's good. And last question, your mantra for effective team collaboration.
Humility. There's no better way to learn.
Absolutely. Well, that was all, I think. Thank you so much for answering all those questions and thank you for your time.